I didn't always love David Lynch. The first David Lynch movie I watched was Mulholland Drive, which I innocently rented as a young teen knowing nothing about the film or Lynch in general. All I knew was that the film had been heavily praised by critics and cinephiles and was a thriller of sorts. At the time, my reference point for thrillers was mostly procedurals like The Silence of the Lambs or twisty, high-concept crime films. And while I don't think I expected Mulholland Drive to be like those movies exactly, I was expecting a plot-heavy narrative built around the psychological weight of a clearly articulated threat. Needless to say, I was blindsided by what I actually got. I didn't understand the film's many dreamy tangents, which seemed to have no connection to the main story, or why the film would establish detective characters investigating the central mystery only to drop them entirely after their introductory scene. Why did the leads suddenly transform, and the film completely shift gears after Rita unlocked the blue box? What was the deal with the cowboy, or the dirty man by the dumpster, and what did they have to do with Betty and Rita? Compounding these questions was my sheer befuddlement by Lynch's style, and I don't even mean the more openly surreal or nightmarish imagery, which I certainly didn't get, but could at least appreciate at a sheer visceral level. I mean the performances, which I found just straight up bad. This movie got nominated for Oscars. Why were the actors behaving like they were in a soap opera? Confused and frustrated, I hated Mulholland Drive. My second David Lynch film came a few years later when I watched The Elephant Man, which was a much more gracious entry point. Telling the true story of the deformed John Merrick and his relationship with Dr. Frederick Treves in the 1800s, the film is the closest Lynch has ever made to a straightforward prestige picture, and in turn, was far less alienating to me at that time. I could better appreciate the film's beautiful imagery and the brilliant performances from John Hurt and Anthony Hopkins, much more in line with my standard ideas for good acting than the performances in Mulholland Drive. I liked The Elephant Man, but not as much as you might think. For all its strengths, I found the film's mix of sentimentality with Lynchian surrealism and hints of horror a strange and not totally successful mix. Moreover, knowing a bit more about Lynch at this point, and how much of an aberration The Elephant Man was within his filmography, the film didn't exactly sell me on moving forward with his body of work. But move forward I did, and the next year I watched my third David Lynch movie, Blue Velvet. I actually ended up watching it twice by pure happenstance in the span of 2 months, once when I watched the film by myself, and again for a film club I was part of. And I liked it too. The film had a lot of the same stylistic elements that had infuriated me in Mulholland Drive, but by then I was older and generally more receptive to these kinds of choices, and the film also had a much clearer central narrative that I could grasp onto. More importantly, the film had Dennis Hopper as one of the most bizarre and terrifying villains I'd ever seen in a movie. Frank Booth's sickness, his unbridled evil, his mix of desperately pathetic and overwhelmingly menacing captivated me. And yet, even with all of this, I still wasn't quite sold on Lynch. The, for lack of a better term, chirpiness of some of his characters still befuddled me. How could a filmmaker be so relentlessly grim and uncompromising, yet also so earnest?
Why are there people like Frank? Why is there so much trouble in this world?
How could he so viciously and obviously satirize the facade of small-town American innocence while simultaneously aspiring to those ideals? It was around this time that I also rewatched Mulholland Drive, and sure enough, a lot of the vitriol I held for the film as a teenager melted away. I better understood that the film was operating under dream logic, where things might not make literal sense, but are connected more through ideas and emotions rather than the causal effect of more conventional stories. Moreover, a lot of the scenes that I once thought were completely irrelevant were actually more clearly connected to the core of the film than I had realized. I was just too impatient to see it at the time. I could also see that the soap opera-esque acting choices I was so incensed by were a deliberate creative choice rather than some sort of mistake, And I better appreciated how Naomi Watts especially could shift between that kind of heightened mode of performance to something more raw and gutting. But of course, appreciation and enjoyment are not exactly the same thing. Much as I could respect the artistry in Lynch's filmmaking, it was still not a style that appealed to me specifically. A few months later, I'd catch Blue Velvet a third time, this time in theaters, and the viewing solidified two things for me. The first was that Blue Velvet had pulled ahead as my favorite Lynch movie. The things I loved, like Hopper and Isabella Rossellini's performances, remained great, but the real treat was being able to experience the film on the big screen and with a large group. Sharing in Lynch's humor, horror, and humanity with a packed room of friends and strangers provided an emotional clarity that my solitary viewings had lacked. The second thing the screening solidified was that as much as Lynch had grown on me in the years since that first ill-fated Mulholland Drive viewing, he still wasn't really for me. Blue Velvet was my favorite of his films, and yet was still more a movie I really liked rather than one I loved. And the further Lynch descended into abstractions and dream logic, the more he lost me. I may have been a lot more open-minded about David Lynch, but at this point, I was resigned to the fact that I was always going to be kept at a distance from his work. But then, in 2017, I watched Eraserhead, and something about that viewing cracked Lynch for me in a way that nothing else had. Maybe it's because I was older, or because my viewings of Mulholland Drive, The Elephant Man, and Blue Velvet had better acclimatized me to Lynch's sensibilities by then. Maybe it's because Lynch's debut feature combined some of his most abstract imagery and surrealist elements with a clear thematic through line in Henry's fear of parenthood and a tight 3-act structure. Or maybe I just needed to see Lynch stripped down to his beginnings. Whatever the case, I finally loved a David Lynch movie wholeheartedly, and that revitalized my interest in his body of work. The timing couldn't have been better. Just a week before I watched Eraserhead, Twin Peaks: The Return premiered on Showtime and generated some of the most euphoric responses of any artwork across the decade. Every week, I'd hear about how wild and exciting and creative the new episode had been, compelling me to go back to the original show from 1990. Seeing the clip of the 9 Inch Nails performing at the Roadhouse sealed the deal. I had to watch this show. From the original series through prequel film Firewalk with Me to The Return, the story of Twin Peaks could be a little uneven and has some infamous dry spells, but the whole was so rewarding that by the end I didn't care. Twin Peaks was so great that the awesome 9 Inch Nails performance, which had sold me on the show in the first place, ended up being the least interesting thing in the episode it was from. Indeed, despite the dry spells, I love Twin Peaks so much that I've watched through the whole series twice, and quite honestly, I could easily go for round 3 right now. And speaking of rewatches, the Lynch films I had once struggled with were now greeted with much more enthusiasm. On a third viewing, Mulholland Drive went from something I admired from afar to something which enthralled me. No longer so concerned with solving the film, I was able to more simply allow it to wash over me, and the result was a marked improvement. The Elephant Man, meanwhile, was catapulted into the echelons of my favorite movies of all time. And this enthusiasm extended to the Lynch movies I still hadn't seen yet. Wild at Heart, Lost Highway, Inland Empire, all of these films were pretty divisive beyond Lynch's most hardcore disciples on initial release, among the most brazenly out there, uncomfortable, and obtuse movies Lynch had ever made. Had I seen them earlier in my life, I suspect I would have been among the haters, but by now, I was ready and more than willing to give myself over to them. At this point, the only David Lynch feature I haven't seen is The Straight Story, and that's entirely because availability in Canada is extremely limited. After a rocky start and a long road of discovery, I did, eventually, become a David Lynch fan. But the discovery was more than just one of fandom. In creating work which tested my patience, which challenged my own internalized ideas about what movies could and should be like, Lynch's films helped expand my understanding of cinema. Engaging with these movies required opening my mind, required being less bound to literal representation and willing to think more abstractly about concepts and ideas. I didn't just learn to love Lynch's movies. I learned to be a better, more literate cinephile. And then, on January 16th, 2025, David Lynch died after a long bout with emphysema, 4 days before his 79th birthday. I won't pretend like Lynch's passing affected me as profoundly as it did so many of my friends and peers. He was not an artist instrumental to my formative years, and as much as I love him and his films now, I also know his work meant a great deal more personally to others than it did to me. Even so, the loss to film culture is seismic and undeniable, and his death did shock me. In hindsight, that seems silly to say, given Lynch revealed back in August that he'd been in ailing health since 2020. But even so, his presence and character were just so singular, it was hard to imagine the world without him. Even now, it's hard to imagine. As thousands of grieving film lovers mourned by watching and rewatching Lynch movies, my choice of tribute watch was Blue Velvet. I could have gone with Mulholland Drive, my first Lynch, or Eraserhead, the movie that made me fall in love with the man. But for me, Blue Velvet was the optimal choice. The film was certainly essential to Lynch's growth as an artist, a comeback in style and reception after the disappointment of Dune, and the film also basically laid the foundations for the noir-tinged stories of the darkness beneath a facade of innocence that he'd continue to build upon across the next 30 years, and it's also a touchstone for many of Lynch's closest collaborators. But my reasons for rewatching the film were ultimately more personal. First, despite watching the film so frequently back in the day, I hadn't actually seen Blue Velvet since that theatrical screening in 2016, and frankly, the film was overdue a revisit. More importantly though, my journey with Blue Velvet is indicative of my journey with Lynch in general. It's a film I didn't much get on first viewing, yet was still compelled to keep coming back to, over and over again, until I eventually fell in love. Great art isn't always easy. I appreciate that David Lynch made me work for it. Rest in peace, David. Thank you for the art and for the education.
Everyone, have a great day.